Good day, this is Rhoel Anastacio from BASS 2-1 and our topic for today is all about primary text, chapter 9, change.
The Only Lasting Truth is Change by Octaviq Butler. Self-discovery can happen while in a leader position because you can realize strengths you might thought you did not have or would you be able to do. As for the last part, God is change, means to me that God is the lasting truth. If the only lasting truth is change and God makes change happen, then God is truth.
A thimble, a small metal cup worn over the tip of one's finger to protect it from needle points, was the engagement item of choice for early Americans. It is just one of the many items that have served as a symbol of commitment to marry. Rings didn't become the standard sign of betrothal until the 1800s, and diamond rings only became standard later stiff in the 1930s. Despite the type about how diamonds are forever, the diamond engagement ring is less than 100 years old, with no guarantee of lasting into the next millennia. Marriage is an institution and a social construction one. Today, we think about marriage as a source of love, care, and commitment, but it was and continues to also be governed by informal norms and formal laws that determine the rights and responsibilities of spouses. Marriage is also a gender institution. It used to be much more so, with substantially fewer rights for women. Diamonds, it turns out, haven't always been a girl's best friend. Marriage has changed and is changing steep. The same can be said for the other institutions we address in these chapters. Sexuality, family, and work. Like diamond rings, things that seem timeless are often recent and fragile. Inventions including many of the things we take for granted as natural, normal, or inevitable today.
Next, the evolution of sex. The notion of the political zealous adherence to extraordinarily strict religious or moral rules was named after the Puritans, and rightly so. They believed that sex should be restricted to intercourse in heterosexual marriage with the aim of reproduction. All non-marital and non-reproductive sexual activities were forbidden, including pre- and external sex, homosexual sex, masturbation, and oral or anal sex, even if married. Violation of the rules will punish by fines, whipping, public shaming, ostracism, or even death. Women were thought to be especially vulnerable to sexual sin because they were believed to be more sexual than men. Men were socially constructed as stalwart, strong, stoic. Women, in contrast, as unstable, indulgent, and emotional. The Puritans considered women to be weaker vessel and consequently to have less mastery over passions. In the reading of the Bible, Eve succumbed to the forbidden fruit not because she was curious, but because she couldn't restrain her desire. Men were supposedly more self-disciplined and concerned with more important things than sex. The Puritans were downright scandalized with the sexual lives of North Americans, native residents, but they were consistently more pervasive than the Europeans. As we previously discussed, many tribes accepted intercourse outside of committed relationships. Both monogamy and polygamy were practiced. Unions were formed and dissolved at will. At same-sex, sex and gender conformity were accepted. After the arrival of the French in the early 1600s, one Anastacio man was warned by a missionary that his failure to please his wife, sexual activity might result in her being impregnated by the other man. He responded, "You French people love only your own children, but we all love all children of our tribe."
This Anastacio man could be rather nonchalant about both sexual behavior and percentage, in part because his tribe didn't subscribe to the idea of private property. His attitude is typical for forager societies that migrate seasonally, following crops and game across the landscape. Anthropologists and archaeologists have shown that both private property and patriarchy consistently emerged together as societies transition from foraging to settled agrarian societies, ones that cultivate domesticated crops. Since for most human history, the only way to prove paternity was to control women, female sexual freedom is often curtailed when societies transition from forager to agrarian economy. Once communities put down roots, both literally and figuratively, there can be ownership of land. Once there is ownership of land, there can be the consolidation of wealth. Once wealth is consolidated, people become concerned with passing it down to hers. And once people become concerned with passing down wealth, it becomes important to make sure wives don't become pregnant with other men's babies. The immigrants who came from Europe in the 1600s had already undergone the transition, and accordingly, they had than the millions of Americans, Indians who populated North America at the time.
Now, let's discuss the topics under the evolution of sex. First is the sex for babies. Differences like those between American Indian tribes and the Puritan settlers are often described in cultural or religious terms, but there were concrete reasons to why the Puritans were so darn political. The colonizers lived a fragile existence. Many people were dying from exposure, starvation, illness, and war. They were threatened with extinction, so production was essential to the group's survival. This motivated Puritans to channel their sex drive toward the one sexual activity that made babies, penile vaginal intercourse. It was against the rules to do anything else and also against the rules to not to do it. Having intercourse with your spouse was required. Women who weren't getting pregnant were encouraged to divorce their husbands and marry new ones. Population concerns also lead the Puritans to be quiet, forgiving when people broke the rules they held so dear. When there was survival in numbers, both obstructions and punishment by death harmed the community as well as the individual. So even though both men and women broke sexual rules routinely, the harsh penalties were rarely imposed. Instead, fines and public shaming served as a mechanism by which the Puritans could forgive sexual deviation. In the Chesapeake area colonies, for example, men outnumbered women 4-1. Women were spared, so even as disgrace, women could count on a man being happy to have her. Like the rules that guide doing gender, the Puritan sexual rules were designed to be broken, with exceptions made with it for their colonies' great good. In addition, for forgiving their own sins, including killing and raping native peoples, they made it impossible for the African women to men, the enslaved, to follow the rules. Slaves were legally denied the right to marry, making non-marital sex and childbearing inevitable. In a cruel twist, white elites would claim that black immorality was a natural inclination of the African race. In order to defend forced breeding and the rape of female slaves, the colonists exalted godliness, but didn't extend to everyone the opportunity to be godly. Their belief in relating sex as intercourse was compatible with their need to reproduce themselves. Eventually, the Puritans' approach to sexuality would fall victim to new and different institutional demands and opportunities, economic change, technological innovations, medical advances, and political upsets. One of those was the Industrial Revolution.
Our next topic is sex for love. Beginning in the 1700s and advancing through 1900, the Industrial Revolution first brought metal tools and steam-powered manufacturing, then factories, mechanizations, and assembly lines. The need for labor drew many people out of small communities and into cities, where people were now densely packed and more anonymous. This was a dramatic change. In pre-industrial agrarian societies, the majority of men and women both live and work at home, were on their own farms or those of feudal lords. Together, moms, dads, daughters, and sons grew crops and tended orchards, fed and slaughtered pigs and chickens, milked cow and charted butter, pickled vegetables and salted meat, and made things like soap, candles, and clothes from scratch. At this time, children were a necessity. Babies quickly grow up to be helpers than farmhands. Industrialization undid all of this. First, it separated work from home. No longer sitting on fertile land, people increasingly had to leave the house to go work in factories, mines, and shops that belonging to others. In return, they receive money, their wage, with which they would go out and buy the things they once made. The process by which goods transition from something a family provided for itself into something bought with a wage is called commodification. The making of something into a commodity, a thing that can be bought and sold. Marital fertility rates dropped dramatically between 1800 and 1900, from 6 or more children per woman to 3.5 in the United States, England, and Wales. In this context, a sexual ethic that restricted sex to effort to make babies didn't make sense. People needed a new logic to guide sexual activity. In response, over the course of the 1800s, Victorians slowly abandoned the idea that sex was only for reproduction, embracing the now familiar idea that sex could be an expression of love. The Romantic era had arrived. The Victorians also introduced the gender love-sex binary, a projection of the gender binary onto the idea of love and sex, such that women are believed to be motivated by love and men by sex. Dualistic thinking about the opposition of the body and soul meant that if women were romantic than men, they sense also less carnal. Reversing Puritan beliefs about women's voracious sexuality, the Victorians feminized love and masculinized sex. As this idea spread throughout Victorian society, women were reimagined as naturally chaste, innocent of the vulgar sexual desire felt by men, and motivated by love instead of lust. Men, in contrast, were believed to be more deeply tied to their bodies, constantly torn between the carnal and the celestial. This is when the idea of opposite sexes really took hold. As it did the sexual double standard, different rules for the sexual behavior of men and women. Prostitution was a way for women to support themselves and their families.
At the same time, it functions to protect the virgin of the weldered.
At the same time, it functions to protect the virgin of the wealthier classes and shield their marriage women from the grosser passions of their husband. Just as Puritans had used the sexual transgression of slaves African as proof of their inferiority, Victorian intellectuals would champion the purity of middle and upper class women and scorn the uncivilized sexual behavior of poor women. Today, we know this as the good girl or bad girl dichotomy, the idea that women who have themselves sexually are worthy to respect and women who don't are not. At the same time, all these ideas were radically new, and they would continue to evolve as American society entered in the 1920s.
Now is the last topic of the evolution of marriage. This is the sex for pleasure. The 1920s was a period of economic prosperity, technological innovation, and artistic experimentation. Americans called the decade the Roaring Twenties. In France, it is called the Années Folles or the Crazy Years. This era saw the invention of sexy. Literally, the word was first recorded to mean sexually attractive in the 1923. The 20s were sexy because, unlike the countryside, the city offered unsupervised mixed sex mingling that lent itself easily to flirtation and romance. In Harlem and other centers of African American life, high-end clubs featuring black musicians attracted white patrons, encouraging racial integration, introducing them to a new form of music, jazz. As historians John D. Emilio and Estelle Friedman wrote, more and more of life, it seemed, was intent on keeping Americans in a state of constant sexual excitement. People in small communities as well as in the upper classes continued the Victorian tradition of calling, at which young men were invited to the homes of young women to chaperone visits. In cities throughout, young working people invited dating. This was dating as we know it today, an effort to find a romantic partner. It was a social strategy. In the interest of being seen and having fun, a successful dater would go out with a different person, preferably an attractive and well-regarded one, every night of the week. Dating shifted the balance of power because it took place in the home. Calling was an activity over which women had substantial control. Women decided who came over and when, how they socialized, and provided snacks on entertainment of their choice. As historian Beth Bailey writes, dating moved courtship out of home and into the man's sphere. Part of the reason men were accorded such as exclusive right involving the expenses, unlike calling, dating, required that someone paid for the transportation, food, drink, and entertainment that the couple enjoyed. This was the basis for treating, a practice throughout which a man found a woman's night on the town. The owner of the establishments, hoping to keep the customers coming, worked hard to convince the public that treating was not a tantamount to prostitution. The inequitable responsibility for the cost of dating was not lost on men. Some were resentful of the fact that women now expected to go out on expensive dates. Men were nostalgic for the good old days of calling, which cost them nothing. For their part, women tried to make themselves literally worth it. Likewise, women began wearing makeup and nail polish, previously used during only by sex workers. During the 20s, an attractive face and body, as well as the certain degree of sexual accessibility, become more center of women's value. Half of all women coming on age during the roaring 20s had premarital intercourse, and being a virgin at marriage was beginning to seem quiet. Many young people were excited by the development and liked the idea of finding a partner who would be a soulmate, someone who brought them joy and happiness. In other words, while the 1920s was a time of rising heterosexual opportunities, these opportunities came with a huge cost of women. The combination of industrialization, urbanization, and commercializations of the leisure and new freedoms for women all increased the ability of unmarried men and women to congregate without supervision. This freedom altered the environment in which sexuality was experienced, as well as the norms for sexual behavior. Eventually, the lifestyle first enjoyed by working class youth in the cities could become mainstream, and the expression of same-sex desire would become increasingly normal. With the exception of the short-lived detour in the 1950s, the sexual attitudes and behaviors of young people had become increasingly permissive ever since. Marital practices have changed just as dramatically. Now we're done to the evolution of sex. Let's discuss the evolution of marriage.
For the thousands of years, marriage served economic and political function unrelated to love, happiness, and personal fulfillment. Prior to the Victorian era, love was considered a trivial basis for marriage and a bad reason to marry. There were much bigger concerns afoot: gaining money and resources, building alliance between families, organizing the division of labor, and producing legitimate male heirs. For the wealthy, and to some extent the middle classes, marriage was important for maintaining the power of families. The concerns of the work classes are similar, yet less grand. Do I marry someone with field near my fields? Will my prospective mate be approved for the neighbors and relatives of whom I depend? Would these in-laws be a helpful for family a hindrance? Marriage were typically arranged by older family members. They thought it foolish to leave something that important to the whims of the young people. This marriage was patriarchal in the origin sense of the term. Men were heads of the household and women were human property, equivalent to children, enslaved peoples, and servants. A woman was entered into a marriage by her father, who owned her until he gave her away on the wedding. We call this patriarchal or property marriage. The husband was the patriarchal and his wife was his property. This logic, the marriage is a form of property ownership, lead to many laws that seems outrageous today. If an unmarried woman was raped, for instance, the main concern was the harm of her father's property. She became less valuable when she lost her virginity, so the rapist could make amends for the bad deed by marrying her. It was a you break it, you buy it rule. In many cultures, she was passed on to her husband's brother. The important thing was her future children still carried her husband's last name. Feminist activists of the 1800s and early 1900s fought to end patriarchal or property marriage. One of the earliest feminist demands was for women to have the legal right to own property rather than be property. This right would eventually make many other rights possible: the right to vote and decide one's own citizenship, the right to work, keeps one's eyes wage, and build financial credit, the right to voice in the family decision, and if divorced, the right to ask for a custody of one's children. All of these issues were part of the early feminist struggles. In response to feminist activism, as well as the other forces marriage would change. By the 1950s, on the heels of the industrialization, a new kind of marriage would be institutionalized, the one that were typically and misleadingly called traditional today. We're going to discuss the evolution of marriage. Now we discuss the breadwinner or housewife marriage. Industrialization broke up the 10 traditional family. As Americans were increasingly pulled into the workplace, husbands and fathers were replaced by employees. Capitalism valued cheap labor regardless of the cost of the family. Since the subordinate status of a woman and children made their labor especially cheap, capitalists were happy to employ them and pay them less. Intellectuals of the time worried that capitalism would destroy the family completely, but instead of abandoning patriarchal marriage altogether, an option advocated by some of the time, men organized to modify and modernize patriarchally. They did so in part through unionization. Pushing back against capitalism, labor unions argued that working men had the right to be able to support a home and family on their wages alone. Through protest, strike, and boycott, unions carved out a new way of life for adult white men. They instituted laws meant to reduce competitions among workers, restriction of child labor, and legislation that banned women and men of color from well-paying jobs, and enabled men's wives to stay at home. Child-rearing allowances and maternity leave. They eventually succeeding in institutionalizing a family wage, an income paid to a male earner that was large enough to support a home, a wife, and children. Built upon the family wage, a new kind of marriage emerged, the breadwinner or housewife marriage, a separate but equal model of marriage that defined men's and women's contribution as different but complementary. Unlike patriarchal or property marriage, breadwinner or housewife marriage did not legally subordinate wives to husbands. That is, she was no longer his property, but it did rigidly define roles. Women owned men domestic service, cleaning, cooking, childcare, and sex. In return, men were legally required to support their wives financially. If either failed to play their part, they could sue for breach of contract. Some societies had stronger unions and therefore strong breadwinners and housewife policies than others. Europe went much further than the United States, West Germany, and Netherlands. For example, paid women a wage for raising their children during the early months, gave big tax breaks to marriage couples with only one earner, and offered cash bonuses for each child. Weaker breadwinner policies and stronger ones made it more or less possible for men to support the housewife while pushing women out of the workplace with more than less force. This was the birth of the American dream. The GI Bill designed to reward soldiers and help them reintegrate into society, offered only while male veterans college scholarship and cheap mortgage. This led to a boom in housing development, to which cities strong power lines and drug sewer tunnels. This government investment transformed America into a land of homeowners for the first time in the history. Home, though, was further from work than ever, and growing distance between the two cemented the idea of separated sphere. What is a separated sphere? A separated sphere is a masculinized work in a feminized home life. At work, male employees engage in production, the making of goods for sale. Since capitalism is a competitive system, factories owners push workers to be as efficient as possible. Men they were presented to become the kind of people capitalism found most useful, more interested in work than family and concerned with maximizing economic success. Living in such a world required that men master the qualities of competitiveness, aggression, and ruthlessness. It's a jungle out there, saying that stereotyping male provider when his wife and kids meet him at the door. Inside the door, he was supposed to find not just a house, but a home. A warm, comfortable space filled with people who cared for him. At home, there was supposedly no production, only reproduction, the making and nurturing of human beings. In creating this environment, women were expected to specialize in a particular kind of supportive and loving emotional work on society's needed. The portion that women could and should wholeheartedly embracing at this work is called the cult of domesticity. It emerged as an idea during the Victorian era, at the same time that fertilized the idea of love and spreading downward to the social classes along with home ownership and family weight. They married by choice and were expected to find comfort in the relationship, but becoming whole in the process of marriage means joining the feminine and masculine together into one household. During this required strict enforcement of gender roles, heterosexuality and monogamy, leading to a short-lived and uneasy experiment, 1950s America.
After discussing the evolution of sex and the evolution of marriage, now we discuss the funny 50s. The icon of Rosie the Riveter signifies the work opportunities offered to women during World War II. In fact, women did enter many occupations previously dominated by men. After the war ended in 1945, however, they were subject to counter-campaign designed to push them back into their home. Marketers, columnists, scientists, public intellectuals, and the US government all decried the undoing of the new breadwinner and housewife family, defending its gender-specific family roles as natural. This resulted in the concerned entrenchment of the nuclear family, as the historian Stephanie Coons explains at the end of the 1940s. All the trends characterized in the rest of the 20th century suddenly reversed themselves. For the first time more than 100 years, the age of marriage and motherhood fell. Fertility increased, divorce rates declined, and women's degree to educational parity with men dropped sharply. In a period of less than 10 years, the portion of never married persons declined by as much as it had during the entire previous half century. All these trends would reverse within the few decades. Historically speaking, then middle-class marriages in the 1950s were worldly family-oriented. In 1952, books and magazines with sexual content were banned. Comic books were considered especially corrupting. In an office report, Congress argued that comic books gave short courses in rape, cannibalism, carnage, neophilia, sex sadism, masochism, and virtually every other form of crime. Likewise, the idea that women were uninterested in sexual pleasure made it inconceivable that women felt for women that what men felt for them. No matter how close women were or what they did together, no one imagined it to be sexual. Out from under any suspicions of lesbian, women formed intimate and romantic relationship with each other. Correspondence between women during this time is full of language like the one found in the letter that Janine wrote to Sarah in 1864. Dear darling Sarah, how I love you and how happy I have been. You are the joy of my life. I can't tell you how much happiness you gave me, nor how constantly it's my thought. Darling, how long for the time when I shall see you. Goodbye, my dearest, dearest love. 1,000 kisses. I love you with my whole soul. In the 1920s, college girls breathlessly described girls on whom they were smashing, a term they used to describe as a same-sex crush. These crushes weren't all platonic. In the United States, the idea of homosexual person as opposed to a person who engaged in homosexual practices was new. The Puritans were familiar with homosexual behavior, but it had never occurred to them that particular people were distinctly homosexual. In their view, all humans were brimming with a political foreseen. Variation in how like a person was to have sex with someone at the same sex was considered a measure of how godly they were, not an intimate preference for one sex of the other. World War II was so conducive to exploring same-sex attraction that it has been called a nationwide coming-out experience. With this newly imaged possibility, some soldiers rejected conventional heterosexuality and after the war, instead pursuing a gay lifestyle. The first gay bars in the United States opened in the 1940s and the first gay advocacy organization would be founded in 1951. Notable, these new communities were most for men. Gay women would remain less visible to the public and each other at least for a while. Women in same-sex relationships were still often read by others as celibate spinsters. Growing awareness and more community among men who identified as gay invoked a backlash. Cities passed laws saying alcohol couldn't be sold to gays and lesbians and they outlaw same-sex dancing and cross-dress. Senator Joe McCarthy, famous for these efforts, said that anyone who opposed him was either a communist or a cocksucker. Mannish unmarried women were also often fired or forced to quit, refusing to perform a feminine apologetic at work. They were suspected at gender deviance and considered a threat to normal families. The politics of the 1950s were unique. They were unusually family-focused, conformist, pro-censorship, and gender policing. We know from the Puritans, though, and from the Burgundian queer communities at the same time, the communities don't always behave in ways that live up to mainstream values. Sex and marriage in the 50s. A young woman in the 1950s might have been seriously concerned about her marriage prospect. Hundreds of thousands of men had been killed in the war. 10,000 of soldiers married foreign women while abroad. The New York Times reported that 750 young women would likely never marry. The process of securing husbands then became serious business. So while in many have made sense to go out with a different guy each night in 1920, fitting from guy to guy didn't seem too smart when there weren't enough guys to go around. Accordingly, during the 1920s, dating was being edged of a new practice, going steady, an often short-lived but still exclusive public pairing off. Going steady was a social security that ensured that a girl would always have a date on important nights and lessened the chances that would end up an old maid. Ironically, this interest in marriage accelerated premarital sexual interpretation in exactly the decade known most of its servantism. Compared to couples who might enjoy just one night together, couples that went steady were more likely to neck, kissing on the neck and mouth, pet, touching below the neck, or go all the way. Others objected to these new trends but couldn't stop them. Necking and petting is not intercourse were becoming expected parts of any youthful romantic relationship. According to the 1952 Advanced Manual of a girl wishes to be a member of the dating group, then mild sexual contact is one of the requirements. Emotionally intense relationships lead to sex and the highest rate of teen pregnancy in American history. At its peak in the 1957, 1 out of every 10 women aged 15 to 19 gave birth. But there was no teen pregnancy crisis. Instead of a rise single teen mothers, the age of marriage dropped to 100-year low and babies born premature. Healthy weight babies that arrived less than 9 months after the wedding reached a 100-year high. At the end of the Victorian era, the median age of the first marriage was 26 for men, 22 for women, and rising by the 1950. It had dropped to 23 for men and 20 for women, and it would remain this way throughout the decade. You will see it in the figure 9.1. By 1963, the game was up. A book called The Feminine Mystique Forever changed the way American thought of housewife. The title referred to a mythology, the idea that women were gleefully happy as wives and mothers, that strongly contrasted with reality. Written by feminist Betty Friedan, it documented widespread unhappiness among middle-class married women in the 1950s and 1960s. Women with recognition claiming that it was a bolt of lightning, a revolution, a bombshell. Friedan's book revealed the cracks in the breadwinners or housewife model, fault line that would contribute to its demise. Strained by separate spheres. While people were now marrying for love, the separate roles for breadwinner and housewife, with the husband working overtime and the wife busy with children and housework, drained the life out of the friendship that couples had built before marrying. The difference in their daily life left the strangers to one another. Less than a third of spouses described their marriage as happy or very happy. Stranded in the suburbs and with few other adults to talk to, privileged wives living the American dream often felt isolated, lonely, and bored. Wives weren't the only ones unhappy though. Marriage was essentially compulsory for men, opened jobs and promotes dependence on their ability showed that they were good family men. Bachelors were considered immature or deviant. Tipping into the sentiment, huge Hugh per lunch, Playboy magazine in 1953, Hefner changed ideas about masculinity, encouraging men to stay in single and avoid commitment. He mainstreamed the notion of man who didn't marry but was anything but gay. As the writer Barbara Etheridge explained, the Playboy didn't avoid marriage because he was a little bit queer, but on the contrary, because he was ebulliently, even compulsively heterosexual. Hefner introduced a new set of gender rules for men that rewarded men's resistance to marriage and monogamy, leading to the still present myth that men must be dragged, kicking and screaming to the altar. Both men and women then enjoyed fantasizing about a life without spouse, kids, and mortgage, but it was woman who was very true vulnerable in marriage. Separate and unequal. While both men and women had their dissatisfaction, women carried virtually all the risks of the breadwinner or housewife marriage. These marriages weren't overtly patriarchal. Just as the Victorian ladies had hope, women were now seen as men's equal, different and complementary instead of better and worse, but women were still financially dependent on men. In androcentric fashion, the masculine spirit of work was evaluated as important and admirable, while the feminine spirit of the home was seen as somehow less so. The imbalance of the value attributed to work and home was literal. Men's work was worth something they received a wage in exchange for it. In contrast, women were working in around the home, just they didn't been doing since agrarian times but getting less credit for it than ever. Capitalist rationality and the new golden rule, be who has the gold makes the rules, replaced explicit patriarchally. It wasn't his penis anymore that made him the head of household, it was his paycheck. Prior to industrialization, women's labor, both the work of maintaining a household and birthing and rearing of child, was understood to be work. After industrialization, however, the separation of work from home, women's labor seems to disappear. It was men who went to work while women just stayed at home because women's work was newly invisible. Housewives seems dependent on men, but not vice versa. Her dependence on his wage was obvious to everyone, but his dependence to her cooking, cleaning, shopping, and childcare often was not. Middle and upper class women didn't just become unpaid and unrecognized housewives. They also gave out incomes on their own, the likelihood of having a successful career in the future, and the status that comes with doing work deemed important. If marriage fell apart, if the husband couldn't hold up his end up in bargain or trade her in for a younger, more attractive and more submissive woman, wives couldn't end up divorced and destituted, often with children. This was not an unlikely scenario. Between a quarter and a third of marriage in the 1950s ended in divorce. The government tried to protect displaced homemakers as they were called by requiring alimony, monthly cash payments to ex-wives from their former husbands, and making divorce legally difficult by requiring proof that a spouse had broken the marriage contract, for example. But marriage remained intrinsically risky for both women. Pretty soon, the idea that they needed secure their own future incomes and opportunities just in case carried quickly bit of weight. Now we're done explaining the funny 50s, and now we continue to the topic of going to work. At the same time that the breadwinner housewife model was emerging to the societal idea, women were leaving the home to go to work. Even at its height, the 1950s version of the traditional marriage was more myth than reality. Due to legal discrimination, the family wage was elusive for the most men, color, and immigrant men. Mirroring the breadwinner housewife at home, office wives filled an important role in the exploding of economy. The newly visible middle class, sitting between manual workers and corporate bosses, opened doors for more and more women to work for pay. By the 1960s, when Betty Friedan challenged the feminine mystique, women are already deciding they wanted a public as well as domestic life. In the beginning of late 1800s, for example, marriage bans, policies against employing married women were common in banking, teaching, office work, and government jobs. A majority of U.S. school districts had bans against hiring married women, as did over half of firms' employment office workers. Even as marriage bans were being discarded by the most industries, many other policies were more resistant to change. This includes protective legislation, policies designed to protect women and children from exploitation by restricting their workplace participation. Beginning in the mid-1800s, almost every American state passed some protectionism law. This became national in the 1920s and banned women from working long hours, during night work, lifting even moderate weights, or taking dangerous jobs, though exploitations were made for jobs like waitressing, housekeeping, and nursing that were for women regardless of these demands. Protectionist law were rationals on the belief that all women were or would be mother, and that state needed to protect their reproductive capacities. While some feminists objected and resisted this law, proper women were glad to have them. Women were more concerned with being able to get promotions to enter jobs that these laws keep on rich were ready to see them go, along with the banners the schools and employers created to keep women from getting degrees in law, medicine, and aviation. They recognized protective legislation and benevolent sexism. The laws used the language of protection to slot young women into largely dead-end jobs. The assumptions that women were unsuited for certain kinds of work or that they would quit to be fired upon pregnancy was a distinctive to both women and employers in the 1950s to 1960s. In 1964, this type of discrimination against women became illegal in the United States in the last-ditch effort to ensure that all bills mandating equal treatment of African Americans would fail. Virginia Democrats Howard Smith added sex to the Civil Rights Act, including sex in the list of characteristics against which workplace discrimination would be illegal: race, color, religion, and national origin. He thought the idea of equal treatment for men and women was a prestigious that it would surely kill the bill. The National Organization for Women, for example, is stepping up to challenge the then prevalent practice of segregating all jobs advertisement by sex category. They argued that advertising job opportunities with help-wanted female or help-wanted male was discriminatory. As the economy grew up and demographics changed through the 1950s and 1960s, married women and mother-old children increasingly entered the workplace as their numbers climbed but their opportunities were blocked. Women's discontent grew both with the current system of employment, with the breadwinners or housewife marriage as a system. They set out to change that. By the 1980s, 51% of women were employed and married, and single women were employed at equal rates. Even 40% of the mothers with children under 18 had at least a part-time job.
In 2003, James Dobson Jr., founder of Focus on the Family, wrote, "Unless we act quickly, the family as it has been known for 5,000 years will be gone." The truth is, the patriarchal or property marriage was already gone, and the breadwinner or housewife marriage was fading fast. The economy was changing in ways that made marriage less essential. Dinner could be eaten at restaurant, maids could clean his house and wash his laundry, and female companionship, both free and paid, was a cocktail lodge away. For women, too, marriage was slowly becoming less essential. The Civil Rights Act, alongside her anti-discrimination law, began to be enforced in the 1970s. The 1972 law against discrimination in schooling opened up a number of professional doors that had been firmly bolted. Women began to look at college degree in more than just a good way to find husband. They began streaming into professional education just as the United States was transitioning from an individual economy founded on production to a service and information economy, one dependent on jobs focused on providing service for another or for others, such as waiting tables, working in nail salons, or providing administrative assistance, or working with ideas like engineers, computers, programmers, and college professors. If a woman could earn a wage herself, a state of financial dependence was less attractive. Since then, created more housework than they contributed, even though she couldn't afford outside help. She had fewer chores to do without a husband around.
Divorce laws changed, allowing both men and women to initiate proceedings without proving infidelity, physical abuse, or failure to provide economic support.
Phyllis Chilafai, a vocal anti-feminist campaigner of the 1970s, denounced such as women as runaway wives and fought the emergence of new feminist social services like shelters for women fleeing domestic violence or hotlines offering support of rape victims.
Balancing work and family. The breadwinners or housewife model of marriage makes even less sense than it did in the 1950s. Both men and women are now increasingly educated and employed for longer periods of their lives. Age at first marriage and first birth have bounced back. The expectation that women will leave the labor force permanently when they have their first child, let alone at marriage, has vanished, as the idea of the man become a good father merely by dropping his payback off the table. In response, the breadwinner or housewife ideal thus has been replaced by the idealized partnership marriage, a model marriage based on the love and companion companionship between two equals to negotiate a division of labor unique to each couple. The laws has cleared the way for such marriage. In response to over a century of feminism activism and demands, the marriage contract today is almost entirely gender neutral, providing the same rights and responsibilities to men and women. Both men and women are now responsible for paying alimony to a spouse who spend time out of the workplace to take care of the family. A male widower can now collect his wife's social security check instead of his own. In the 1950s, the 1960s, and 1970s, only reverend wives could do this. Men no longer have special rights to manage the family money. Nearly all states now confer equal standing to both spouses in issues of the child's custody. Today, we see family-focused dual-earner couples working part-time and taking turns caring for kids, and work-focused dual-earner couples working overtime and hiring gardeners, maids, and nannies. Increasingly, the idea of monogamous, polygamous unions or more than two people and open relationships in which couples negotiate extra per sex are part of the conversation about what relationship can look like. Marriage no longer determines one's living arrangement. While it remains the norm that couples will live together once married, some don't. While marriage is still normative, it is not surprisingly anymore for people reach their 30s, 40s, or 50s without marrying. For these reasons, marriage itself is less necessary than it was in the past, so much so that we might ask whether it is still a major institution. Some people choose to live together without being married, others nearly married nor cohabit. Nearly half of Americans, 44%, have lived with someone without being married. Fully 41% of non-married people say that they don't want to marry or are not sure. Parenting now occurs in the absence of marriage. Today, 40% of children are both to unmarried parents. A majority of Americans, 86%, says that a single parent and a child count as a family. Meanwhile, about 1 of the 5 Americans is really choosing not to have children. As Stephanie Cons explains, the same thing that made marriage become such a unique and treasured personal relationship during the last 200 years paved the way to it become an optional and fragile one. People divorce. When they do, they often take children with them, sometimes into a new marriage, creating blended families. Americans engage in what sociologist Andrew Cherlin calls the marriage go-round. They both marry and divorce more frequently than people in the other countries. Since marriage is more about choice and pleasure than ever, it makes sense to someone to reduce further the rules about who can marry whom. In 1967, the United States Supreme Court struck down the laws against interracial marriage, and in 2015, the court made same-sex marriage legal in the 50 U.S. states. Same-sex marriage rights are now the law in Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, England, Wales, Finland, France, Germany, Greenland, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, and Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Scotland, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, and Uruguay. These decisions are increasingly paving the way for the trans women to be able to marry whom they choose with granting. Despite the ascendance of this new partnership model, the disgendering of marriage law and the legislation of same-sex marriage, the breadwinners or housewife model is still a choice through our personal lives and political debates. It competes with some lives generally alongside the partnership model, producing the type of trouble that contradictions cause. Still, despite the trouble and despite of the glamour to return to the breadwinner housewife model of marriage, partnership marriage is here. Maybe not to stay, but for now. And that's all about with my report.
Once again, I am your reporter today, Rhoel Anastacio, and I leave you a quote: "Blue sky gave me peace and makes me feel alive." Thank you for watching and listening my report. God bless.